At the top of a glass skyscraper, far removed from the frantic rhythm of the streets, a man stood still before an untouched glass of wine. Adrian Cortez. A name that graced business magazines and society columns, an empire built on luxurious hotels scattered across the globe, a fortune that could buy almost anything except the courage to hand over his own heart. At 38, he had already learned that love could be the most expensive and dangerous investment of all. Helena, the woman he once swore to love, had turned the altar into a stage for public humiliation, and since then, Adrian had built walls as high as the towers he owned. From up there, gazing at the horizon, he seemed untouchable, cold, calculating, a man whose eyes weighed every word before it was spoken. But that night, fate had no intention of letting him hide behind contracts and numbers. A charity gala gathered the crème de la crème of Spanish high society, the kind of event where smiles were as rehearsed as the speeches. The hall sparkled with crystal chandeliers and endless camera flashes, and amid champagne glasses and hushed murmurs, one name echoed through the corners like a provocation: Lara Montoya. Lara, 27, a storm draped in silk. Known for a string of scandals that kept the tabloids fed, photographed at parties until dawn, yet rarely seen truly smiling. A young woman who, beneath the glitter and the chaos, lived trapped under the claws of her stepmother Letitia, a woman who turned control into art and manipulation into habit. For Lara, freedom felt as far away as the horizon line. It was Rafael Dominguez, Adrian's longtime friend and master of provocation, who struck the spark. With a grin full of challenge, he leaned in and whispered something that would change the course of the night. "I bet you couldn't win over Lara Montoya." Adrian raised an eyebrow, more out of boredom than curiosity. But Rafael didn't stop there. It could be a bet, but with terms. A marriage, 3 months. With an expiration date, he said. It would be nothing more than a game. The prize? For Adrian, nothing more than the satisfaction of winning and proving to himself that he could control any situation, even the unpredictable. The billionaire weighed the proposal like a risky investment. Lara Montoya was everything he avoided: unpredictable, emotional, with a life far too exposed. But there was something about the idea that stirred a dormant part of his mind. 3 months, no more. A contract, no emotional risk, only strategy. He could handle that, right? Meanwhile, Lara, surrounded by curious eyes and hungry cameras, smiled in a way that looked more like armor. She didn't yet know about the bet, but life had taught her to recognize opportunities in disguise. A marriage that could give her distance from her stepmother, and her suffocating grip might be the breath of air she needed. Even if it was only an arrangement, maybe it could be her chance to reclaim something she had almost forgotten: the feeling of being free. 2 opposite lives, bound by a pact that was nothing more than theater, or so they both believed. He, a man who had turned his heart to stone. She, a woman who had learned to hide her fragility behind scandal. But fate, with its quiet irony, was already setting the stage for a story that would break their own rules. And in that moment, between toasts and whispers, a question floated invisibly in the air, just as provocative as it was inevitable. Would you accept a love with an expiration date? Because for Adrian and Lara, the clock had already started ticking, and every second brought them closer to a dangerous game, one where losing might, for the first time, mean winning everything. So, are you ready for another incredible and emotional story? Help this magical channel grow. Like, comment, and subscribe. Every gesture from you fuels new stories. And tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. Barcelona awoke to another day, but in Adrian Cortez's world, the dawn brought no surprises, only the repetition of an unyielding routine. At the head of a hotel empire stretching across continents, he lived surrounded by efficient assistants, meetings timed to the minute, and million-dollar decisions made with the precision of a surgeon. To many, he was the portrait of success, a man at his peak, imposing, elegant, untouchable. To those who truly knew him, he was also a man who had closed the door to any possibility of emotional involvement. Ever since Helena, the woman he once believed to be his future, had turned his wedding day into a spectacle of betrayal, Adrian had stopped seeing love as a feeling. He treated it like a bad business deal, one that only brought losses. In another corner of the world, Lara Montoya's life ran in parallel, miles away on the map, but dangerously close in the web of events about to unfold. At 27, Lara was a constant presence in gossip columns and an easy target for the fastest camera lenses. Always photographed at parties, wearing daring outfits and with an expression that seemed to challenge the world, she was sold by the media as the embodiment of impulsiveness. But a closer look revealed something more. Behind the headlines and glitter of nightlife, she lived under the watchful eye of her stepmother, Letitia, who controlled her every move with a mix of coldness and emotional blackmail. Since her father's death, Lara had inherited not just a fortune, but also an invisible prison, filled with obligations, forced commitments, and the constant threat of losing what little autonomy she still had. Fate saw fit to cross these two worlds during a charity gala in the most luxurious wing of a five-star hotel in the heart of Barcelona. The hall was filled with important names, strategically placed works of art, and a soft background music that allowed for discreet conversations. Adrian moved through the room with the posture of a man who commanded his own territory, greeting investors and celebrities. A few meters away, Lara arrived with Letitia, wearing a dress that drew every eye and camera flash. Her entrance was like a sudden gust of wind, impossible to ignore. Between one toast and another, Rafael Dominguez, Adrian's close friend, and a man known for turning provocation into a personal sport, approached with the mischievous look of someone already plotting. He whispered in Adrian's ear, mentioning Lara's name with an almost taunting smile. He pointed her out in the crowd, describing her as an impossible challenge for someone so calculating. Adrian followed his friend's gaze, studying the young woman from a distance like one might assess a rare painting that might not fit in the collection. Raphael's provocation came with a proposal: win her over, not just with charm, but with a contract. A 3-month marriage, with a clear start and end date. No real involvement, just a convincing act for the world to see. Adrian could have laughed it off and forgotten the idea, but it lingered in the air like a tempting negotiation. There would be no room for emotional risk, only strategy. He had faced hostile takeovers, market crises, and ruthless competitors. Why not take on this personal operation as well? Meanwhile, across the room, Lara smiled for photographers, exchanged rehearsed words with socialites, and pretended not to notice her stepmother's calculating gaze trailing her like a shadow. Deep down, she carried a quiet exhaustion. The promise of an arrangement that could distance her even temporarily from Letitia's grip might be her ticket to breathe again. She didn't yet know the details forming around her, but her instincts told her something was about to happen. That night, beneath crystal lights and conversations heavy with hidden intentions, the first threads of a story began to intertwine. Two opposite worlds, two lives shaped by different wounds, about to collide not by chance, but through a bet that seemed, at first glance, to be under control. What no one there could foresee was that behind the calculations and appearances, this story would escape control entirely. Lara wore a long red gown that defied any attempt at modest description. Her hair fell loosely over her shoulders, and though she smiled, there was something in her eyes that didn't match the scene. Something distant, as if she were in a place no one else could reach. Raphael provoked Adrian again. "I bet you can't win her over. Not with gifts, not with trips, not the way you usually do. I bet she wouldn't fall for even your famous calculated coldness." Adrian let out a brief laugh, more dismissive than amused. But Raphael wasn't there for idle banter. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Let's make the bet real. A contract that everyone will believe. You convince her to accept and keep the act going until the deadline. No feelings." For Adrian, this wasn't about Lara. It was about proving he still had absolute control over any situation. 3 months posed no threat, It was enough time to manage an agreement and then move on. Raphael smiled, took another sip of his drink, and told his friend, "I want the satisfaction of seeing you move for something that's not a hotel or a business merger." Adrian didn't answer immediately. Silence stretched as he looked back at Lara. She, in that moment, seemed unaware of the conversation, laughing at something a socialite said, though her posture betrayed that the laugh was more rehearsed than genuine. Hours later, in a less formal moment of the party, chance, or perhaps Raphael's intention, led to Adrian and Lara being introduced. The handshake was firm, but brief. Lara looked him up and down with the expression of someone who already knew his type. Powerful, used to winning, probably arrogant. Adrian, in turn, realized immediately she was not as predictable as he'd imagined. There was a quiet intelligence behind her quick responses, and a certain disdain for the superficiality around them. In the days that followed, the proposal began to take shape. Raphael, true to his role as provocateur, worked to bring the two closer. On one side, Adrian calculated every move as if negotiating a multi-million-dollar deal. On the other, Lara, even without knowing all the details, began to notice that this man appeared in the right places and in the right conversations. When Adrian finally presented the idea, politely, as if it were a business proposal, Lara didn't react as he expected. There was no scandal or shock, only thoughtful silence. A marriage of convenience for 3 months, with clear benefits for both. For her, the promise of temporary freedom from Letitia's control. For him, a project with an expiration date. She lifted her chin, locking eyes with him. "And if I say yes, are you sure you can keep this as just an arrangement?" Adrian met her gaze and replied with cold certainty, "Absolute." In that moment, without realizing it, the game had already begun. And behind the apparent simplicity of a contract, something far more complex was starting to take shape, something neither of them was prepared to handle. The marriage of Adrian Cortez and Lara Montoya was announced with the force of lightning cutting through a clear sky. Within hours, major news outlets splashed photos of the couple, flashy headlines, and endless theories about what had brought them together. Some claimed it was overwhelming passion, others, a marketing stunt. On social media, short clips captured glances and gestures, each dissected as if hiding secrets. The event itself seemed drawn from a meticulously crafted dream. The chosen venue was one of the most luxurious hotels in Adrian's empire, overlooking the sea, with glass walls reflecting the golden light of the sunset. Flowers imported from across the world formed a fragrant corridor leading to the altar. Lara appeared in a flowing white silk gown, the fabric moving like water with each step. Her hair fell in soft waves, adorned by a delicate veil swaying in the barely there breeze. Adrian, in a flawless suit, stood tall and maintained his usual composed expression. For the cameras, they were perfection. The moment they said "I do" was met with the crackle of camera flashes, and every brush of hands, every faint smile, was captured. Lara held her gaze as if determined to prove to everyone, including herself, that she was in control of her decision. Adrian, for his part, offered the kind of presence that commanded respect, while revealing nothing beyond what he chose to show. The reception unfolded with impeccably set tables, live music, and a menu that looked like a work of art. Distinguished guests mingled, greeting the couple and wishing them well. At every step, Lara moved with the trained grace of someone who had long lived under the spotlight, while Adrian accompanied her with quiet firmness, his attention sharp to every detail. Behind the spectacle, both knew this was the first day of a contract, not the beginning of a love story. As the lights of the party began to soften and the most important guests departed, the atmosphere shifted. Away from the cameras and curious eyes, they made their way to the honeymoon suite, perched on the hotel's top floor. Silence followed them down the hallway, broken only by the discreet hum of the elevator. Upon entering, Lara walked to the panoramic window, where the moonlit sea stretched out before her. Adrian lingered a few steps behind, watching her with the same focus he gave any new challenge. Then she turned, offering a brief, almost ironic smile, and said something that completely dismantled whatever image he had built of her. "I've never been with anyone before." The words hung in the air. Adrian, a man accustomed to handling revelations and negotiations, understood instantly that there was nothing here to bargain over. Lara's gaze did not ask for understanding or judgment. It simply stated a fact. He moved closer, slowly, keeping enough distance not to invade her space. In that moment, there was no reason for pretense, not in the face of such an intimate, unexpected confession. The rest of the night passed in a strange calm, as though they both needed time to process the weight of what had been said. Sitting at the edge of the bed, Lara removed her veil and let it fall to the floor, watching it as if it symbolized something she was leaving behind. Leaning against the wall, Adrian poured wine, but her glass remained almost untouched. They exchanged few words, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the city slept. Inside, two strangers shared the same space and a silent pact. There were no cinematic kisses or whispered promises, only the awareness that this was the first step in 3 months that could drag on endlessly or pass in a breath, and that somehow it was already less simple than they had planned. When the lights went out, the sea still beat against the rocks, indifferent to what happened in the suite. But for Adrian and Lara, the night had left something invisible in the air, the realization that, despite all calculations and safeguards, nothing in this agreement would be as predictable as they imagined. The seaside mansion where Adrian lived was a perfect reflection of his personality. Modern lines, glass walls, absolute silence broken only by the distant sound of the waves. That was where he took Lara after the wedding, a place spacious enough for them to coexist without crossing paths if they wished. At first, that was exactly how they moved, two bodies in the same space, following parallel routes, avoiding unnecessary intrusions. But daily life has a curious way of dissolving distances. Adrian, used to having every detail of his life managed by a trained team, began to notice small, subtle shifts in his routine. Instead of spending her mornings sleeping in or losing herself in social engagements, Lara would disappear early into the gardens behind the property, an area he rarely visited, walled in by ivy-covered stone. There, she would spend hours with her hands in the soil, planting, watering, trimming leaves with a care entirely at odds with the image the world had of her. One morning, Adrian watched her from a distance, without announcing himself. Sunlight filtered through the trees, scattering patches of light across her face. She was so focused on her task, she didn't notice his gaze. The scene didn't match any of the mental portraits he had built before meeting her. The surprises didn't end there. One afternoon, while reviewing documents in his office, Adrian heard the faint rumble of an engine and hurried footsteps in the hall. Curious, he followed the sound to the entrance and saw Lara unloading boxes of supplies from a pickup truck. Without drawing attention, she carried them into the kitchen, then disappeared again. Intrigued, he quietly asked a staff member for an explanation. That was when he learned Lara had been making discreet trips to a nearby fishing village, bringing food and clothing to families in need. There were no cameras, no reporters, just the quiet actions of someone determined to help without being seen. These gestures began to change the way Adrian saw her. He still kept his guard, still reminded himself it was only a contract. But gradually, he realized he was paying more attention to her than he intended. He noticed how she called the staff by name, how she listened to their stories with genuine interest, how she laughed at simple jokes. One night, a storm raged outside, the sound of rain filling every room. Adrian found her in the kitchen, wearing an oversized sweatshirt, making hot chocolate. Without speaking, he sat at the counter and watched her move. Lara broke the silence with a simple comment. "The garden looks beautiful, even in the rain." The conversation that followed was brief, but something about it was different. It wasn't strategic exchanges or polite remarks, just two people talking about something seemingly unimportant, but carrying a quiet weight. As the weeks passed, the initial distance began to transform into an almost imperceptible familiarity. Adrian still kept his reserved demeanor, but no longer avoided crossing her path in the halls. Lara seemed less guarded, as though she was beginning to discover this place could be more than just the backdrop for an arrangement. Still, none of these changes were spoken of openly. There were no declarations, no emotional confrontations, only gestures, glances, and small moments that meant nothing alone, but together formed something new. And as the days moved forward, Adrian found himself silently questioning something he would never admit aloud. Could a contract really become something more? The doubt lingered quietly, like the steady rhythm of the sea against the rocks outside. And so, without hurry and without a plan, the mansion, once his private fortress, began to turn into the setting for something neither of them had foreseen. The night was quiet in the mansion, interrupted only by the distant crash of waves against the rocks. Adrian was finishing contract reviews in his office when, for reasons he couldn't explain, he decided to walk to the library, a room he rarely visited, large, lined with dark wooden shelves from floor to ceiling, filled with old volumes. Opening the door, he found Lara there, sitting on the floor with her back against a sofa, leafing through a worn antique book. She looked up when she noticed him, but didn't close the book or stand. She simply watched, as if trying to understand why he was there. Adrian moved closer in silence, crossing the space between the shelves. The light came from a lamp in the corner, casting a soft glow that gave the room an almost intimate air. "I didn't know you liked to read," he said quietly. Lara closed the book gently, running her hand over the cover. "I didn't know you had an entire library," she replied with a faint smile. Adrian sat on the sofa behind her, and for a moment no words passed between them, only the sound of rain growing heavier outside. Lara held the book in her lap, but seemed more interested in the comfortable silence than the pages. He watched her for several seconds, noticing details he had missed before. The way she lightly bit her lower lip when thinking, the fall of her hair over her shoulder, the attentive yet unhurried look in her eyes. Something in that moment cracked the carefully constructed images they both carried. His, of unshakable coldness, hers, of constant rebellion. Without realizing when he started moving, Adrian reached out and brushed his hand lightly against her cheek. The gesture was slow, almost hesitant, as though testing his own boundaries. Lara didn't pull away. Instead, she kept her eyes fixed on his, and in that instant, it felt like an entire conversation was happening without sound. The library, once just another room in the house, became a space suspended in time. Neither seemed willing to break the moment. Adrian, a man used to controlling everything with logic and distance, felt something he couldn't measure or plan. Lara, for her part, didn't rush to interpret the touch. She simply accepted it, as if recognizing there was something there that didn't need to be explained. The silence stretched for a few seconds that felt longer than they were. Outside, a distant rumble of thunder rolled, and the lamp's soft light continued to trace the contours of her face. Adrian slowly withdrew his hand, but the weight of the gesture lingered. Lara opened the book again, not to read, but simply to have something to hold. He leaned back into the sofa, unsure whether to speak or let the moment end on its own. In the end, he chose silence. Shortly after, she stood up, placing the book back on the shelf. She walked past him, casting one last glance before leaving. There was no smile, no words, only an expression that blended curiosity with something he couldn't quite decipher. When he was alone again, Adrian realized that something invisible between them had shifted that night. It wasn't a sudden change, but a crack in the barrier they had both maintained since the beginning of the arrangement. And though he tried to convince himself nothing had changed, he knew that moment in the library would not be forgotten so easily. The tide seemed to have quietly turned between them, but not everyone was willing to accept this closeness. Outside, the public image of Adrian and Lara was still the subject of constant speculation. Social media dissected every appearance, and newspapers splashed any detail that could feed public curiosity. Among those voices, one operated with much greater calculation: Letitia. Lara's stepmother had always known how to manipulate information to her advantage. And now she saw the marriage as an opportunity to regain the control she was beginning to lose. Lara's visits to the fishing village and her increasingly independent routine triggered an alarm in Letitia. More than ever, she needed to remind her stepdaughter who set the rules. It began with seemingly innocent phone calls, invitations to formal meetings, subtle messages. Lara refused most, claiming prior commitments. But Letitia was patient. One afternoon, while Lara was helping in the estate's greenhouse, Adrian received a call from a journalist he knew well. On the other end came the direct question, "Is it true your marriage began as a bet?" The words made him pause for a few seconds, but he answered coldly, denying it and ending the conversation. Still, one thing was clear. Someone was whispering dangerous information into the right ears. In the days that followed, small pieces of evidence began to pile up. An old photo of Adrian and Raphael at a private dinner circulated in gossip blogs with captions hinting at a secret arrangement. A columnist published an article about the year's most unlikely relationship, quoting close sources who claimed the couple lived under contractual clauses. Lara, upon reading the piece, felt her stomach twist. That night, she walked to the terrace to be alone. The sea was restless, and the cold wind seemed to cut through her skin. Adrian found her there, leaning on the railing, eyes fixed on the horizon. "It's Letitia," she said before he could even ask. "It's always been her." He stepped closer, but kept a respectful distance. Lara explained that her stepmother would never accept losing control over her life, and if she could, she would destroy any chance Lara had of escaping. The manipulation was nothing new, but now it came with a fresh threat, exposing the truth about the marriage. Adrian stayed silent, listening. He knew denying the seriousness of the situation would be pointless. At the same time, he didn't want Lara to believe that the recent closeness between them had been nothing more than the result of a wager. The following days were heavy with tension. Lara, who once filled the house with her presence, began avoiding long conversations, as if afraid of hearing something she didn't want to. Adrian, in turn, kept busy with meetings and short trips, but his mind always circled back to the same question. What to do when the truth threatened to walk straight out the front door? Meanwhile, Letitia intensified her moves. A call to an influential columnist here, a casual chat with a photographer there. The news began to grow more invasive, and rumors of an imminent crisis in the marriage gained strength. One night, Lara received a short message from her stepmother. It could all end tomorrow. No context, no explanation, just the raw threat. She didn't reply. She put the phone away and, in silence, returned to her room. She felt she was standing at an invisible crossroads, either confront Letitia head-on or prepare to watch the contract, and perhaps much more, collapse in front of everyone. In that moment, the sound of the sea seemed different, heavier, as if echoing the tension now gripping the house. Everything could indeed end the very next day. The morning began with a dense silence, the kind that precedes a storm. Adrian was already in a suit, ready for a meeting, when he received confirmation that Letitia had discreetly summoned the press to a hotel in the city center. The sources were too reliable to ignore. She intended to expose everything. The bet, the contract, the clauses, every detail planned to destroy not only Lara's image, but his as well. He took a deep breath, closed his briefcase, and canceled all his day's appointments. There would be no more postponements, no half conversations. If Letitia wanted a stage, he would choose the moment and the words. On the drive to the city center, the car moved along Barcelona's wide avenues while messages flooded his phone. Journalists wanted to confirm rumors. Acquaintances sent veiled questions. Even some business partners tried to find out what was about to happen. Adrian ignored them all, focused on the decision he had made. When he arrived at the hotel, cameras were already lined up at the entrance, journalists jostling for a front row spot. Lara's presence beside him was immediate and striking. She wore a simple dress, but her posture was steady, her gaze fixed, as if she feared nothing. Still, Adrian felt the tension in the light grip she kept on his hand. They walked together into the reserved hall for the press conference. The space was packed, flashes firing without pause, microphones pointed at the small podium in the center. At the back, Letitia watched with a discreet smile, as if she believed victory was already hers. Adrian stepped up to the podium and waited for the chatter to die down. When he began to speak, his voice carried the same controlled tone he used in high-stakes negotiations. But there was something more, a clarity that left no room for ambiguous interpretations. Many of you came here looking for a scandal, and yes, it's true that my marriage to Lara began with an arrangement. The room reacted with a wave of murmurs and the frantic sound of camera shutters. Letitia straightened in her seat, ready to savor her triumph. But Adrian continued. What isn't true is the intention behind the story you're being told. It wasn't a game. It wasn't a bet to humiliate anyone. It was a beginning, a different one. And what began as a contract has turned into something that no longer needs clauses to exist. He paused briefly, looking directly at Letitia before turning back to the cameras. I love my wife. Not because she fits into some plan, but because she is the woman I chose to love. The words fell into the room like a rupture. Some reporters leaned forward, trying to catch every detail. Lara, beside him, kept her eyes fixed on him, as if she wanted to remember that sentence forever. Then, with a slow and deliberate movement, Adrian took an envelope from his pocket. He tore it open in front of everyone, letting fall to the floor the pieces of the contract that had bound them at the beginning. There is no longer a deadline. There is no longer an agreement. There is only what we choose to live from now on. The impact was immediate. The flashes increased, murmurs turned into a wave of voices, and Letitia lost her smile, replaced by an expression of silent fury. Adrian ended his speech, thanking everyone for being there, and without answering questions, he stepped down from the podium and extended his hand to Lara. She held it firmly, and together they walked across the room toward the exit. Outside, the afternoon sun lit the city, but for them, the feeling was of a new beginning. The press kept calling their names, but at that moment, the noise felt distant. The decision had been made. The contract was over. What remained from then on would be by choice, not by obligation. The sky began to brighten, tinting the horizon with soft shades of gold and pink. The waves advanced and retreated in a calm rhythm, breaking into white foam on the wet sand. Adrian and Lara walked side by side, barefoot, feeling the pleasant cold of the morning on their feet. There were no cameras, microphones, or voices calling their names. Only the sound of the sea and the steady beat of their steps. Lara looked at him, and a gentle smile formed on her lips. It was different from all the smiles she had ever shown in public. There was no pose or calculation, just the simple truth of being beside someone who chose her unconditionally. Adrian returned her gaze, and for a moment they seemed to communicate without words, as if all the turmoil of recent months had dissolved with the tide. The wind played with her hair, and without thinking, he reached out to brush a strand from her face. The gesture was natural, almost automatic, but carried an affection that needed no explanation. Lara closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing the touch, then continued walking. Behind them, their footprints were imprinted on the sand, slowly disappearing as the water approached. It was as if the sea erased their marks, carrying away the weight of the past, the sensational headlines, the accusations, the judging looks. What remained was a free present, no contracts, no bets, no spectators. Adrian took a deep breath, feeling the salty air fill his lungs. For the first time in a long while, there were no calculated plans or set goals in his mind. Only the certainty that he wanted to live this moment and all the ones to come, with Lara. She, in turn, seemed lighter, as if the tide had also carried away the constant pressure that had followed her for years. They paused for a moment near a moss-covered rock. Adrian leaned on it and extended his hand for Lara to come closer. When she did, he gently pulled her nearer, and for a few seconds they simply stayed there, listening to the waves crashing against the stones. There was no hurry, No need to say anything. The memory of the previous day was still fresh. The press conference, the tearing of the contract, the reporter's surprised silence. But now, in the soft morning light, it all felt distant. The world could keep commenting, creating stories, trying to interpret every gesture. They knew the truth, and the truth was simple. They chose to be together because they wanted to, because they needed each other, because they found in the chaos something rare and true. Lara took a few steps forward, approaching the line where the foam met the sand. The cold water touched her feet, and she laughed softly, calling Adrian to join her. He went without hesitation, and soon the two were with waves wetting their ankles, like children testing the sea's patience. The sun rose higher, casting a golden glow over them. The light reflected on Lara's face, and Adrian realized this was the kind of image no camera could capture. It was something that existed only for those who were there, living that moment. With the sea as their witness, he held her hand again. There was no formal promise, no elaborate speech, just a firm and silent grip, like an invisible pact. Lara responded with the same intensity, and together they began to walk again, letting the morning unfold before them like a blank page. The beach stretched long and empty ahead, and with every step it felt like there was more space to breathe. Neither looked back. The past had already been carried away by the tide. The future they would write with their own hands, one day at a time, with the same certainty with which they now walked, side by side, united, free, and real. And so, with the sun rising and this couple walking toward a future without scripts or contracts, our story comes to an end. But what doesn't have to end is your journey here with us at Enchanting Stories. If you enjoyed following every twist, every glance, and every splash of the sea, go ahead and hit subscribe to join this growing community full of people who love great stories and heartwarming endings. Oh, and don't forget to leave your like. It's our 3-month contract. Just kidding, it's forever. Your support helps the channel bring even more passionate plots and characters who stay with us long after the video ends. Now it's your turn. Tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. Maybe we'll discover a network of story lovers spread all over the world. Or who knows, love might be closer than you think. So, activate the notification bell and come live more magical moments with us. Because here at Enchanting Stories, every video is a new chapter, and you're part of it.